What's good, everybody? My name is Alckemy. Welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be talking or trying to cover a really important topic, which is people struggling with writing bass lines, struggling with how to make mid basses work, how to make a lot of your low end work with your drums. Now, I can't solve every single problem that you have, and to be fair, there is a matter of musicality that you have to have, but I am going to be going over some key things in which to cultivate getting better at bass lines, talk about the philosophy about how I start thinking about approaching them depending on the kind of track that I work with, and why a lot of stuff that you've learned probably is a trap. And that's probably the one that I want to open with, because if you're brand new, then honestly, like if you're just like writing beats and it's very basic or something, like the short version is just write a bass line with a really simple sine wave to your chord progression on the low end. That always works if you have a chord progression. But something that I kind of want to dive deep into, because I know that, you know, attention spans and boredom and all that stuff, and not that I'm here to waste your time, is very of the essence. Something that is very common, especially with people among my community, is making randomized quote-unquote mud pies, kind of like this. Hold on, let me get this ready. You know, lots of different stuff on here that we can kind of utilize to create different movements. And then what we'll do is we'll just hit one note. These are available on alchemy.com if you're interested, but maybe we can do a couple of these and just kind of go through some. And then you're like, okay, cool. All of that was in D sharp, and then you're like, okay, sick. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start building something, and I'm going to start putting, you know, a track together, and I am going to do exactly this. And guys, this is like the number one thing. So like, this is all hypothetical as well. You guys have seen me write music on stream almost every day, so I don't feel the need to try to get a track started in front of you. But what I will say, and if you haven't, then go check out my live streams, because I mean, I wrote a track today, even just now. But what a lot of people do is they'll get into something like this, and they'll start with a kick drum or kick snare pattern, usually something like this, and do this, and then they'll start fucking fishing for cuts that they think is going to work and be interesting. So if you can pull this off, then hats off to you. Because the problem with a lot of this stuff is that there's zero context to the inception of what it is that you're trying to do, other than you are trying to make something happen out of a kick snare. And the problem with a kick snare is that it is the exact same thing, especially if you're doing this with, you know, let me mute all of this. You're essentially trying to write something interesting to this. And the problem with it is that it's very difficult to make it sound like it's working together, because there's no relationship between what it is that you have. So, you know, in theory, a lot of mistakes, or a lot of where people get really frustrated, is they try to do something like this. And feel free to raise your hand if you're guilty of it. I did this for years, and I was like, oh, I can make cool sounds, but why can't I apply this? I would place a sound like this and then try to, you know, fish for a cut or whatever, and then be like, let me unmute all this stuff. This is going to sound ridiculous, I'm sure, but... Okay, hold on one second. Let me get this going. There we go. You know, just something stupid like this. And the thing is that it sounds ridiculous, because I think that the approach, while there is some truth to searching and fishing for cuts, kind of like what I'm going to show you here in a little bit, is important. The thing with this is that the entire approach is like setting you up for failure. So the number one thing that I would encourage you to do is to get out of this for a little bit. we'll come back to it. Get out of it for a little bit though. Instead, I'm going to teach you how to make a very simple 808, and I want you to practice writing your bass lines and your rhythms just with 808s. Now, it's important to talk about why 808s work. We're going to be using phase plant today. This is going to be extremely simple. What we're going to do is take this, grab the harmonic to 3, turn this down a little bit, doesn't even need to be important. Grab yourself a distortion, something like so. Let's give it some saturation. Grab yourself a limiter, and let's go ahead and grab a slice EQ, and this is something that I want you to be aware of. When I play this, let me go ahead and turn this on quickly. Check this out. So if I open this up, we've got our first harmonic. This is our bass right here. This is our third harmonic because we don't have a second harmonic. So you can see here that we're jumping from 1 to 3. But on this, all you want to do is just make sure that this is a little bit more quiet. And you can even do this by boosting a little bit and reducing a little bit. And once you have something like this, look, we've got a really nice 808. If you want to make it slide, grab yourself a glide, hit legato, and now. And if you want to make this even more interesting, then what I would start to play with is actually, this is going to sound ironic, but do some filtering. And then grab another distortion, and then you can start to beef it up slowly. You can slowly build the distortion over time. That's a tip that I got from Cage. Thanks, Aiden. I appreciate it, brother. But if you slowly add distortion over time, then you go from something like what we just heard to something like this. See how we're starting to build now? And the key to it is to try to like get away from it being too squarified, quote unquote. But once you have that, super easy. Now, part of what makes this work as a means of like, hey, I have trouble writing bass lines, is that once you have a groove, this is the most important part, I feel, is like, instead of going for a kick snare pattern, try to give yourself a groove. That can be a melody, it can be percussion, it could be a combination of all the drums together. But if you were to do something very simple, such as, you know, writing yourself a trap beat, this is why trap is so easy to make, because a lot of times when people do this, they've got a kick on the 1, a snare on the 2. So something like this. Right? And all you have to do is just play along to the kick. So we can just kind of place a note here. And what we want to be mindful of, because this doesn't always apply, is the overlapping sounds that we have going on. So if you notice on this in particular, I am going to cut this off whenever the snare hits. And as a contrast, or as a means of showing you how this can be different, the next thing that I'll be showing you is what happens if you make this long. So take a listen. Except right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this over, I'm going to duplicate this, and then we can change this into something like an octave. If you're having trouble writing melodies, play with octaves and fifths, which is 7 semitones either up or down. 5 also works, 3 also works. Usually we write in a minor key, but this is like extremely specific. So the second piece to making this work is throwing everything, throwing your kicks and snares within a group and then sidechain it. So in order to sidechain, I'm not going to really teach you how to sidechain, but just know that this is being sidechained. So now whenever the kick and snare hits, it's going to duck the bass. And now all we need is some kind of percussive loop or something like that. I don't know. Okay, sure. And we're just going to take this and put this in here. And this is also sidechain. So okay, so that's not quite what I want it to be. This is more so going to be not a tutorial on drum percussion and stuff, but if maybe I can set this to something to where It already works though. Like it's already something that is gelling well together. So the second piece of this is picking like one centerpiece of what the loudest part of your mix is going to be. So contrast is key, right? If everything is big, then nothing is big. If everything is small, then nothing is small. If everything is small and one thing is big, then it's going to stand out a lot more than the other. In terms of kick and bass, a lot of times, for me anyways, I love having extremely large kicks, and I love trying to make my subs pretty much as loud as it seems balanced. So this is a rule of thumb. Please just take it as a rule of thumb, just as a place to start. But something that I do very commonly is I make my basses 2 decibels more quiet than my kick. And my kick is always at 0. I don't gain stage. The reason why is because I use a clip to 0. But one way to solve this, especially if you want to add a little bit more grit to it, is I grab a newfangled saturate, I set the drive to 2, and then I turn on the auto gain. So now, no matter how much I drive this beforehand, it's always going to be technically -2. So check this out. But that's not why you're here, right? So, I know that this isn't like, it's like, oh, I can make an 808 work, but what about your mid basses? What about all of that stuff? What about writing riffs? What about XYZ? Before we get into that, I think that it's really important to consider that context is everything, right? And instead of thinking I'm going to write some drums and then I'm going to add some bass to it, but how do people get such creative basses and such creative sounds and XYZ and all that? It really starts from the idea of movement. Keep that in your pocket for now. You need to change the entire approach for when it comes into making heavy music. The reason why this also doesn't work, because I guess one strategy that you can do, sorry that I'm kind of jumping around, but one strategy that you can do is, let's say this doesn't work as a main bass. Well, this is something I do all the time, is instead of having like an 808 or something on every single hit, what I might do is create that space like I was talking about, pull this snare away, and then be like, okay, on this section, I'm going to do a fill. And I'm going to leave this on this kick in order to do something a little bit different and have a little bit of contrast. So remember, we want this to be a little bit more quiet. I'll just turn this down and try to match it with the energy of the kick, but now this sounds pretty lame, right? Now, for one, there's not a lot of sub in this, or it's the incorrect sub. So there's that. Making sure that your low end, especially on your mid basses, and having and what does KH say? An identifiable fundamental tone is crucial in order to make this stuff work. Because if it's just randomized, it doesn't really give you any context as to what you're actually hearing. And especially if you're playing this on loudspeakers, it just sounds like high-end jargon, which is okay. And if that's the case, like let's say this doesn't have good sub, you can just replace it. It doesn't have to match the movement always. You're gonna have to kind of like finagle with that. But with something like this, right? This might be something that kind of sounds cool, but the phrase doesn't really fit the context and the time of what is happening. So in order to do that, this is where we talk about movement. This is where we start talking about making things work. Is like, yo, I just resampled this, so it should be ready to go, right? It's like, no, you got to do more to it sometimes. So instead of this just being, whatever, especially as a beginner, because I know that like, at least when I started learning these basses, I was like, oh, okay, well I made the bass and then now it should be ready to go, right? It's like, no, sometimes you need to add more EQ or more compression or more distortion. You always need to be willing to go the extra step. And the more that you embrace it, the more that it's going to become less of a hassle and more of just a understanding a problem and then being proactive in solving that problem. So in this particular case, right, now that I've added this movement, it's something to think about of how to apply this in context, which we'll get into writing with main basses. So within this, we need to think about a phrase, right? So it could be a blah, it could be a wow, it could be a do do do, it could be, something rhythmic or something that you need to be able to modulate or automate as a phrase in itself, because this, like on its own, just isn't enough. So even if I do something simple like this, maybe turn the resonance down. But now it has movement. Now it has something that actually kind of makes sense. And while this bass isn't the most interesting or whatever, you know what I mean? Sometimes by adding even just one simple tool, shout out to Minimal Audio, Fuse Compressor is the shit. But sometimes, not always, you can get some really easy, like, I guess, strength by adding distortion or some kind of OTT. I like this one in particular. I'm not saying that you should go buy it. I do have a review on it, but I like this one because I like the way that it sounds, and I like that it has both upwards and downwards and this middle thing in between. Also, turning the basically all these knobs up makes it really loud, and it helps bring out the quiet parts of the sound, which is usually the high end when we're talking about bass. So now this is a little muddy right here, so maybe if I dip this out, now we were able to apply something like that within a fill. So whenever I'm balancing basses and I'm doing fill basses in general or something, I usually have the intention on actually making fill basses. And a lot of times this kind of stuff that I have available on my website is meant to be stuff that is for fills. And the reason why is because this works best whenever we're doing pitch bends and stuff. So like I said before, if you're doing something like this, right, then it becomes a lot easier to actually apply, because we just take that movement, and again, it becomes less of the role of something that you need to feel and more of something that signifies like a transition or a reset in the rhythm, right? So if I were to do something like this, let me mute that real quick. Well, now I've got some different pitching and stuff to work with. Now, the other part of this is understanding that making stuff fit within the same world, so we're talking volume, frequency, stereo placement, and all that stuff, again, might require more. So for example, we put a fuse compressor over this or whatever, but maybe we want this to actually have some space because we want it to be bigger. The first step that we did on this was to, there's a little bit of tail end on this, but look, there's nothing else that's on this. So if anything, you might want to use like a reverse sample that's going into the next piece. Or what we could do is turn that off, and we could apply some reverb. What? Reverb on your bass? What? You're crazy. Look, here's the thing. If it works, it works. And there's different ways to do it and go about it. I'm just going to show you a very quick way. What I've done was I've created 2 chains, not like the rapper, and I have created a high pass here to where only the mids and the highs are going to actually have that reverb. Now on here, what's cool is that this is the wet signal and this is the complete dry signal, so I can pretty much process this more if I want to, or I can just mix it in subtly until I find something that's going to fit within the adequate, I guess, or what feels good. And this is the part that I can't tell you. I can't be like, turn this to 11 o'clock. And if you're trying to get that out of this video, then this is not the video for you. This is like, yo, thanks, Ichigen. This is like, here is a concept and here is the approach on like why stuff works and why you're having trouble and whatnot. So yeah, if we were to apply some reverb here, now it's too much, right? So all we have to do is back off of this. Maybe bring it back just a little bit. So, and the other thing too is sometimes whenever you are utilizing stuff, especially with respaces, it doesn't always work, but every once in a while, I'm just gonna use a filter. But every once in a while, depending on where you might use a notch and cut, it might help accentuate some of the movement that you have for the voo, 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 voo. So again, I think that all this stuff is stupid. This doesn't sound good. I'm going to show you some real use case scenarios later in the video. You can skip ahead if you just want to see what kind of music I make or whatever. But now with all that stuff in mind, as far as like attacking application, the first exercise that I want you to do is to start thinking about being more meticulous with how you set up phrases, right? So for me, this is intrinsic because I make these all the time. But if I'm actually trying to use this as like a specific bass or something like that, you see that I have these phrases. And what these phrases are designed to do is to create things that are usually natural or usually common within within a track. So what I'm talking about is something that is going to fit within the rhythm or within the context of the groove that you already have. Or maybe just something that starts really strong, right? So like a downbeat bass. The downbeat bass is the first hit of the beat. So, you know, Tetsuo's Redemption from Cohen Sound comes to mind, to where it's like boom, right? Boom, dom, 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 dom. So creating that, excuse me, is not very difficult to do. Even though I have all these things, right? If I were to turn the phrases on, I'm sure at some point I can get something that's going to make like a donk. So. So even within this, it's not perfect, but within that last hit that I got, it's serviceable because it has a very clean tone. So look. So I know that's going to be usable, and I might need to color it up. I might need to make it more exciting, but I know that because it has a lot of rich harmonics and I know that it's thick, it's going to be something that I can use in which to build something off of. Now, the thing about building bass lines and stuff is that we have something called call and response. So, you know, when I say, hey, you say, yo, I've been using that stupid analogy for years. But if it's all within a single note, then you need to be really creative with how you start to build things. So let's say, you know, this is just a basic bitch pumpkin spice latte, you know, downbeat bass. Okay, well, we need to be practicing bass lines on our own, at least in my opinion. So with this, maybe instead of me trying to go fish and create something, I can start thinking about another kind of rhythm, or I can, you know, play a couple of keys, or there's a bunch of different ways to describe this with, you know, here's a downbeat bass that establishes the fundamental, and then on the response, it could be something rhythmic, it could be a melody, it could be both, or it could even be an effect with like a sound effect, right? It doesn't even need to be a fill bass. It could just be a sound effect. But a lot of times what people end up getting into, kind of like what I talked about before, even when writing call and responses and stuff, is, do I have, okay, let's just get some more. Let's get some other ones in here. Is, you know, they'll bounce out a bunch of stuff like this with a bunch of random movement and whatever and all that. And I know that I'm probably sounding like a hypocrite right now because I do this more than anything. But the difference is that this is all just a starter kit in order to get into the intention. So once you have something like this, you've established a call, right? And what that means is that every bar, not every bar, it could be across 2, 4, 8 bars. The bigger your call and response, the harder it is for people to keep up with. That's why like a lot of people don't get IDM because they have really long call and response times and stuff that has like crazy phrasing and stuff. But, you know, if we're doing something simple to where it's like, dun, you know, maybe right here we're just going to play something on that last beat. So this actually works. And the thing with this is that we need to start thinking about and audiating what could go in between. So now that I have this boom, right? So what if I were to, you know, take something like a sub or whatever and do a very simple thing. Actually, we already have a sub, so we can just use that. But there's this in between that you can start messing around with, and that's my second piece of advice, which is don't try to make a bass line just out of one sound. That's why I like to make these patches, so that way I have a diverse range of things. When it comes into phrasing and all that stuff, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be like, you know, an exorbitant amount of basses and an absorbent amount of like presets and stuff that you have pulled up. I do give myself quite a bit, but a lot of times it's not even quite that necessary. But if you have, say, a mid bass and then you have a sub, then a lot of times it increases your chances of being successful, because you can always rely on the deepness of something that has that pure sine wave fundamental, or, you know, even like a square saw or something that's just an analog signal. It can be digital, but I guess what I'm saying is that it's producing a relatively raw waveform, even if it's distorted, and it's very easy to tell and feel what's happening on the low end. So just adding in one more colorization. Now, this is the next piece that I want you to listen for. Have you noticed that this sound is cool, but it actually doesn't fit within the time signature? It's late for one, but then it's also like boo wah. And this is something that a lot of people aren't aware of. And so something with this is that a lot of times when people try to take movement from randomized basses and stuff, and this was something that I had to learn, the movement doesn't match the groove or the rhythm that you've created. So listen to this. It's going ba-va. So what I might want to do is maybe cut this up and then place this over here. But now I've also left a space. And so something else that I can do is create like a bass or like a sub. I'm trying to use these terms without being without overlapping, but I can place this here and do like a note very quickly. So like let's see what that sounds like. Now we're cooking. It's starting to come together, and what we're starting to hear now is something that has a groove. And whenever you do this, everything is on grid right now, but like, you know that I make halftime music, you know that I am somebody that likes to make everything really groovy, and so you need to start figuring out how to make grooves happen within your bass lines as you're practicing this skill. Just work on bass lines for a bit. Just have fun. You don't need to like do anything else. And then once you have this, dude, it's like everything that I've been teaching you from before up to this point, right? Because what we can do is we can group these together, and then we can start creating anything out of anything, right? So what I mean by that is if I grab a frequency shifter, just as very quick context, and this is just going to be a beginning point, and I think that's really important, is that I'm not trying to impress you with any specific sounds. I'm trying to teach you about the idea of how to get from one thing to another. But once you have something kind of like this, then you can start to mess around with this frequency shifter or distortion or things. The extractor plugin right here is going to basically create like a transgate. I need a disc tube because I like distortion. But we can do any kinds of effects. Just close your eyes, pick a bunch of them on there, make sure that there's a clipper or a limiter at the end, and then you should be fine. Actually, the only other thing that I would say is be very careful of too much feedback on a delay. That's when stuff gets painful, and your ears will thank me if you follow, or rather heed my advice. But anyways, so check this out. Okay, great. So there's some funky sounds in there, right? Is it the most interesting? Not necessarily, but now that I have contrasting sounds, some sounds are low, some sounds are high, I can actually elaborate on this stupid bass line or whatever. So now we can pick something. Okay. Da, da, right? Okay, so I probably want to move this over and place it here, but and the thing is that if you can repeat something and it sounds interesting once, you can repeat it again. And once you are giving yourself something that has, you know, something kind of catchy, then what we can do is we can start variating the call and response. So let me try to paint this out for you. This is basically call A, right? So the call can be anything. It can be as long as you want. So it can be this. That can be the call, or it could just be this. And then the response, on the other hand, can be response A. Let's color that something differently. Something kind of like this. And this can be response A that could span from here all the way through, because it's just what is the beginning of the phrase and what is the end of the phrase, right? For me, I personally feel like this doesn't change, so call A and then response A. But now that we have this, just to kind of paint this picture for you, something's wonky here. Oh, there we go. We need to make sure that this is in time. Now, here we go. So we got call A, response A, and feel free to do this. Like, make a template and like put this up and say, okay, this is my call, this is my beat. This is not how you write music. Like what I'm talking about right now, you can, but this is a cultivator. This is a drill. This is something that you could practice when you feel uninspired or you feel like, you know, your sounds need work. This is also assuming that you have access to sounds. It's not hard to get access to cool sounds these days, especially with things like Splice and, you know, all kinds of people's presets and stuff. Not even mine, you know, go find your favorite artist. I'm sure they have some kind of sample pack. So anyways, we have call response A. Maybe this time we do call response B. And we change this. That was supposed to be changed anyways. We do call and response B. And this goes into basically composition, but we go maybe on this time we go, and maybe just for funsies, we're going to do, let's just go ahead and bounce a sound out. All that stuff is pretty cool. So let me pull this off. Let me open this up. Let's go into a saw wave and then go make sure that the bassy thing is on. So now we can do something like, oh, we need to detune this. My bad. Here we go. Cool. So let's just pretend like this is something that's cool. Again, this is purely for context. But what we can do with this B now is place this somewhere in here. And we can kind of just fit this in relation to this. But what we're trying to do now is we're trying to create a dance between all these sounds. We're trying to say, hey, this goes right here, this goes right here, this goes right here, XYZ. But as a means of creating, you know, a bass line, this is how you need to be thinking about this. And keep in mind too, right now we are just isolating the low ends and the low mids or whatever. We're just isolating bass sounds in general because we are trying to focus on how to cultivate this. This is going to help you out a lot if you have all different kinds of percussion and things that you can rely on that are going to enhance the groove. If you make your song about a groove like this, that's okay, but it's going to change the dynamic in which how you build your drums, about how you build the percussion around everything, right? And that's why I think this is so important to talk about, because where you start dictates how you approach things. If you make dubstep and you go and you shoot for that kick snare, because I used to make dubstep, you shoot for that kick snare and then you try to place basses over it or whatever, it's not going to work out the way that you want it to, because you're going to feel really uninspired because you're making a really uninspired groove. And sometimes like this initial hurdle with dubstep can be extremely difficult, right? We're going to talk about intention with this here in a little bit, but I think that it's incredibly important for you to just practice this and understand the overall approach and to do things this way to where you can take this part of the song and just say, hey, I'm going to practice making hooks. I'm going to practice making a call and response, bass line, whatever the heck you want to call it, and just focus on that. And if all these sounds aren't working or whatever, you go back to the beginning, you focus on 808s or, you know, simple sine waves, and you focus on the basics of building melody, building rhythm, repetition, or, you know, working on your call and response as a whole. So anyways, now that we have this, I don't know if this is going to work or not, but this is still the way that I think. So now okay, so maybe with this, we might want to color this differently. Okay, I'm glad that it's covered, but we can do that same thing that we were talking about. Actually, we don't need to do this. What we need to do is place it on this. Now I've noticed that the sub is taken away on that, and that's just something to be mindful of, but you can kind of either use this as an effect, or something that you can also do is, again, try to pit this up and play them differently against each other. So this bass goes up, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your bass has to follow. And I wanted to tell you all this because people think that there's some kind of defined rules about what you're supposed to do. The rules that you're supposed to apply is FAAFO. Fuck around and find out, because you never know. So with this, we can kind of just create a nice easy pitch bend. Now, whether or not this fits is up to you. But you get what I'm getting at. So on this, I can utilize this in order to kind of play back and forth in between what's going on. This doesn't have enough sub in it, so maybe I might want to EQ this, or maybe I might want to duplicate this track. And again, try not to be lazy. I'm lazy in a lot of different ways. I'm lazy but resourceful, I think, is the skill that I'm cultivating. But let's say the sub isn't working. Well, I can just take that out now and turn that off and delete all this other stuff. And now I've created a unique track, so it's a bit much. So as long as we don't have that sub, now we can make that work within the context. So now we have call A, call response B, call A, response A, call A, response B. And then what you can do is practice being like, okay, now we're going to do call B in response A, or we're going to go call A, response A, and then instead of this being here, we're going to do call B, response A, and then we do something different with this. So we can do, like, let's say there's a kick right there. We can do like a really cool, downbeat bass that's like, or a pitch bend, or just something that's rhythmic, or something that's like, absolutely insane. You're asking me what that looks like. Sometimes I find it through this. Sometimes I just go and design it. Again, I can only explain one thing at a time, and there's so much to cover within this that I'm still not going to get everything within this video. But I do hope that this is going to help some of you all out, because I wish that I would have had this kind of talk like when I first started trying to make bass music. All right, let me turn that down. Let's turn this up. We can do something as simple as that. So just a wow, right? And if you have a kick with a heavy sidechain, then a lot of times it's going to help sound like an impact, which is really cool because it will go wow. So, just keep that in mind. Or if you really want to, then you can just kind of take a kick like this. Shout out to Zane. Find a kick that seems somewhat suitable. I'm just looking for something electronic. Okay, there we go. And what I'm going to do is literally just force these against each other, kind of like this, and crossfade. So now here's what we got. So when you're developing this, you need to have a wide array of sounds. And if you're just trying to write a single bass line off of like one particular sound, a lot of times it's very difficult for it to stand on its own, unless if you have something with the inception of creating a rhythm or something with intention at the very beginning. And now we get into the second phase of this, which is understanding movement in general. Music, at least as a song, works with time, and whenever we work in a DAW, we are on a timeline, and within that timeline we're working with a specific BPM, And there are certain measurements that we use in order to calculate when, a repetition starts, or, how long do we let something go, at least in like traditional music and stuff. So with that, if you can kind of have a tempo in mind, which a lot of times just turning the metronome on is extremely helpful. Well, when we start with movement, what do we want to fit within this measurement of time, which is usually within a bar or a beat, or, there's other different ways to do this. And it doesn't have to be 4/4, but just as an example. So for me, if I can come up with something that has a groove intrinsically, then it's something that becomes a lot easier to design. But you don't have to like make the craziest basses. You don't even have to like, do stuff that sounds insane. You need to start cultivating at the source, which is the movement part. And one of the easiest ways that we can do that is by using LFOs. LFOs create movement and patterns. Even if you don't know what to do, if you were to just take the same thing that we did from before, right? So we'll just make another 808, turn this down a little bit, perhaps. I'll do it here in a second, and then just a little bit of distortion. But what we do is we create 100%, and then on this one, let's say 30%, and then let's just overdrive it, saturate it a couple times, and see what happens. Now, whenever I play something like this, it's going to do that. It's going to basically play a pattern. Sorry, that's the wrong one. I did the wrong thing. So now if we place this within a beat, we can use the table morph in which to find different phrases, right? So once we have this movement, once we have something that we're aware of, all we have to do in order to make this cooler is pretty much attach everything from what we do here on to that LFO and start to build a relationship of effects that interact with each other. So, more distortion is always great, but maybe I don't want it to be distorted the whole time. Maybe what I want to do is I want to bring it up kind of like this. That sounds pretty good. So now I just created something, I evoked something, and I want more of it. So now what I can do is I can use something like a pseudo OTT. Sorry, this is huge. I was teaching a lesson a couple of days ago and had to blow everything up, but I can use something like the dynamics here and start to pull that up. Well, maybe I want to make that, a little bit more interesting and just do something to the high end. Okay, well that's kind of cool. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to duplicate this, and I'm going to set this to a different harmonic and turn this down. And now you see everything is kind of just matching within itself. And I'm doing all this by the seat of my pants. So, if it turns out stupid, it's fine. But what I'm saying is that I'm giving you examples of what ends up happening whenever you are trying to find a piece of movement kind of like this and create phrases to it. Maybe we can send this out to lane 2. I didn't mean to do that. So that sounds pretty cool. Let's go ahead and add that to this as well. So that way it's going to go wow. Well, guess what? Now that we have this, we can change the rhythm of this. We can put it off. We can manipulate this. We can also change the phase. So for whatever reason, and this is really important, if you are wanting to do things that are off-grid, one of the best things that you can do, especially in this particular situation, is to set this to free. I have another way of how to solve this, and I have that available on masterclasses and whatnot. But let's say you want this to have like a weird number of times that this repeats. Then what you can do is select the number of time that you have, and just say, okay, I'm going to play this. And now, whenever we do this, it might be wise to put a note down so that way it's always going to retrigger at the same time. But let's say I wanted this to line up here, and I wanted this to create this. Well, now check this out. So I've got motion now, I've got rhythm. And so if I've got something that either matches or I'm trying to find something that's trying to play with that, I started with an 808. I'm not saying that you should design all of your sounds based off of an 808. I'm just saying that this is something that works. You know, even when it comes into crazy bass noises and stuff, you know, with pitch bending and all that, that's all getting into the compositional aspect of it. Treat your bass as like an instrument. You got to play it like that. But don't just like be like F and then that's it. Think about how a person or how you would express a sound. And a lot of times doing that by singing it or by saying it, Corey calls it audiation, where you're singing something out. Do it in the context of bass. You know, if you have this cool thing in mind to where you're like, wow, like record that out and make your movement match the phrase of that. It doesn't matter how successful you are in recreating the sound in your head. It's more so about practicing the motion of that in order to fit the context of the groove, because the context is always key. The last thing that I'll leave you with is doing insane sound design that can sometimes work to a melody. This is something that Kunis and I have talked about on our channel. It's something that I've talked about with a bunch of other people. But if you have something, say, you know, something like this, it doesn't even matter. Do, you know, just very easy. Okay, then what you need to do is get yourself a rolling sampler. I'm not affiliated with them, I just totally believe in it, but set up a resampling channel, whatever, and start doing your sound design to this and start changing stuff. Couple key things with this limiter. Try to have your super low end, like everything below like 110, relatively in mono. Make sure that you have an identifiable fundamental, and play around with destroying the sound as much as possible out of that, and play with different octaves, play with changing the melody, keep it maybe within harmony, or use a frequency shifter and just see how insane that you can get. But once you have that, all of the fundamentals that we just built at the beginning of this video start to come into play. So this should be how you start looking at making mid basses and all that stuff apply. But the number one thing that I can tell you is focus on your groove, focus on that identifiable fundamental, even if it's just a sine wave, because you can always distort a sine wave. You can always bring it up to match, you know, the energy of the kick. Don't overthink how cool your basses and stuff need to be. Literally, guys, I guess I'll leave you with this. This is the most common neuro bass that people call sine compression and stuff or whatever. It's kind of not really what's going on, but check this out. So we have this, we have noise, turn this down a little bit to like here, grab a distortion, make sure that this is activated, and we want to distort this side. Sorry, not this side. These are actually different, but we want to distort these two together, and there you go. If you want to create some kind of motion with this, you can add in like a ring mod, which a lot of people do. You can send out separate signals, but this is something that a lot of people use in their music. You might want to EQ out those mid harmonics, kind of like what we talked about, and then maybe just dip some of this stuff. but this is something that it works. That's why people do it all the time, is because it works. You can mess with the noise levels. You can mess with a lot of the different types of distortion. And like I said, you can add a ring mod or split your signal. So that way, just as a context, you can get, different kinds of movement like this, where you're here, right? But it doesn't matter. It's more so of the sense of you're starting with something simple and then adding and building on top of it. But the motion, the movement, the context, the intention behind what it is that you're doing is really what you're going for. If you have a crazy melodic thing and then you just try to go for like pushing F, then you need to be really creative with the kind of movement that you go. But just thinking about all of the cool basses that you hear within the music that you listen to is kind of setting you up for failure, because it's what is surrounding that moment that makes it so special. And that's something that I want to talk about in a future video, which is learning how to actually listen to music and learning how to take inspiration and reference other tracks. But I've only got so much capacity for one video at a time, so I'm going to have to leave you with that. I hope that you guys enjoyed this. If you want to support the channel, alckemy.com. You can also book a lesson. You can also like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can buy merch, which I have a little shelf on YouTube. Lots of different ways. And if you guys could also check out Evolution JKD on YouTube. It's my instructor's channel, but I do the editing, and then I'm also on the channel all the time. So thanks everybody. Have an awesome rest of your evening, and I'll see you next time it's time to talk about something.